You become a doctor to take care of patients. You become a doctor to serve humanity. Ambient intelligence allows for the patient and doctor to be a patient and a doctor. That like it used to be.
MedEdge helps you focus on what matters most. MedEdge, the all-in-one solution.
Hi, I'm Tony Stadehar, the president of Jackson Physician Search, your executive partner and trusted physician recruitment firm. Come visit our virtual booth to discuss your physician needs, but until then, I hope you enjoy this great event.
We've documented over $8 million in saving. What we're really thrilled about, though, is just the individual member testimonials. Once we get it set up and running, it really takes on a life of its own, sometimes with suppliers, and we make a real difference in the financial viability of their practice.
Did you know that Scrub-In Uniforms is great for groups? With easy-to-set-up custom ordering portals and convenient payment methods, we take the stress out of buying uniforms for your team.
Hey, this is James from Relation, the class category leader for patient outreach in 2020. If you've been doing more with less this year and introducing new workflows to keep patients and staff safe while continuing care, it's time to connect. Stop by the Relation booth and watch our presentations here at the conference.
Eagle count. Decom count. 15 seconds. 3, 2.
Audi e-tron, the next frontier of electric.
CareCredit is proud to sponsor the Leadership Pathway for the Medical Practice Excellence Conference. Recently, more than ever before, we have seen firsthand that smart, solution-driven, passionate, and compassionate leadership is vital to the business of healthcare. CareCredit is dedicated to your leadership potential, and we are thrilled to support the commitment to growth and continued pursuit of knowledge within this educational pathway. Now, onto the session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Weberg, and I'm the Senior Editor at MGMA. Welcome to today's session, A Steady Captain in a Stormy Sea, 8 Effective Ways to Lead in Crisis. We have a few reminders before we begin. If you view the live session, you can claim ACMPE, AAPC, ACHE, CME, CPE, and CEU credit. Claim continuing education credits starting next week using the MGMA CEU portal. The code for AAPC credit will be emailed to you. Submit your questions, resources, and comments using the chat area. To view the chat area, exit the full screen and then select Chat at the bottom of the screen. Slides and resources can be found in the lower left section of the previous session page. The education for this session now will begin. In today's session, Amy Greeter, Senior Vice President of Coker Group, and Alan Bierling, Senior Vice President of Sparrow Hospital, will explore key strategies to manage complex and stressful situations. Amy and Alan, I know you've got a lot of great information to share, so I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today. As I was just introduced, my name is Amy Greeter. I'm a Senior Vice President with Coker, been with the healthcare consulting firm going on 13 years now. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live with my husband and 2 perfect children. If you're a mom, you understand what that's like. I am joined today and have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Alan Bierling. Alan is the president of Sparrow Hospital, which is the flagship of the Sparrow Health Systems hospitals. Alan is not only a great hospital administrator, he's also a clinician by training, and I am privileged to call him my dear friend. We are thrilled to be with you today, to be talking about a topic that at the time we submitted, a year ago, didn't realize was going to be quite so relevant. So it's a little bit eerie to be talking about this today, but our discussion today is really going to focus on how do you maintain a steady and constant present in an ever-changing sea. So we're going to talk about practical tips today for leadership in crisis. Alan and I have both had the good fortune, and we look at it truly as good fortune, to have been party to some very real and significant crises for various healthcare organizations. And the reason that we consider it our good fortune is that we have the ability to look, now being on the other side of it, at ways that we have learned, things that we could have done better, things that we now have as experiential knowledge that we bring into to share with you today and bring into our organizations to help in the future. So we're going to spend some time today briefly going through our key learning objectives, and they're here on the screen. So we want to talk about how do we create an atmosphere of psychological safety within an organization. And here the literature is clear that psychological safety is not only necessary for higher order thinking like innovation, but it's also absolutely critical for day-to-day operations within an organization. We're also going to talk about the SMC approach to containing crises, to de-escalating them. And then finally, we're going to talk about effective crisis communication plans. And how do we really look at differentiated plans based on the type of crises that you are preparing for, and good preparation is a necessity, or that you're currently facing. So with that today, know that we're going to run through the agenda. We're going to really specifically spend some time talking about those 8 ways to lead in crisis, and then we'll get to all the others that I mentioned. So with those brief introductions and housekeeping items out of the way, I want to turn things over to Alan to really share a couple of opening remarks. So Alan?
Amy, thanks very much. I'll start off with crises come in all varieties. They come in financial crisis because you don't not only meet your targets, but you have strong headwinds that sometimes throw your organization, your practice into great turmoil. You can have a crisis of clinical nature where you have an unexpected, unfortunate outcome, and that gets played out on the front pages of your local newspaper and TV sets. We've seen that happen. You can certainly have crises that are natural, Hurricane Harvey. You can have crises that are more functional and facility-based, whether it's a factory explosion or balcony collapses or any number of those kind of things. And then you can have those sort of crises that are reputational in nature and can be devastating. So your CEO is forced to leave in a flurry, or one of your physicians is forced to resign based off of something that we would consider to be improper along the way. And in today's world, that's just not that uncommon. There literally are cameras everywhere we turn, and we constantly have to face these sorts of things. So we'll talk about how to go through those crises together and some of the things that you can do to stay stable throughout that entire process. Having now experienced crisis of every nature in my some 40 years of doing this business, I can tell you that the same standards apply almost all the time. And how to go through these crises is not that difficult as long as you are intentional and you are pragmatic about your plan. So Amy, if we can.
Thanks, Alan. So as we break into today, as I mentioned before, we certainly didn't know where we would be sitting when we finished this application in 2019. We didn't realize that 2020 was going to be a trying time for so many organizations in so many different ways. We are, of course, no stranger to adversity in healthcare. We see it all the time, and Alan mentioned all the ways in which he personally has seen it. I think so many of those will resonate with so many in the audience today. Certainly, 2020 has pushed us in new directions. Maybe we've had to face things that we've never faced before. But the reality as leaders, there's always some sort of crisis that's either befallen us or is waiting in the wings. And so as leaders, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we really focus our organizations first on preparations. I can't underscore the need for appropriate preparations. I can't tell it enough times. Preparation is key. Now, we don't always have the luxury of having prepared for everything that we're going to face, but there are a series of themes that we need to look at in terms of preparation, and we'll touch on those briefly today. But let me mention that having a team that's established, making sure that you're looking at appropriate protocols so that when disaster does strike, you're ready for it. making sure that you have some templated communications so that, again, as you're in the throes of things, you've got some templated materials that you're ready to go with. I would say that while leadership in a crisis is important, equally, if not more important, is this concept of being a leader in those preparatory actions. So as we talk today, we want to make sure that we're thinking about some of the questions that are really important as we prepare. I'll turn your attention here to this slide, which really looks at what are the questions we should be asking ourselves, again, both in preparation for and during a crisis. So first of all, how can you look at supporting your ongoing mission and vision? I would tell you that it is important to have both an ongoing mission and vision and a crisis mission and vision, and making sure that your crisis mission and vision relates back to your ongoing mission and vision. Alan will talk about that in the communication planning, but certainly you have to be able to understand what you are driving for, what is your true north. And that may be a little bit differentiated during a crisis, but it's got to relate back to who you are as an organization and what you value. Number two, how do we make sure that we're mitigating concerns for our employees, our patients, and other stakeholders? There are going to be a lot of people that are turning to look at us as leaders once crisis hits. Just this week, I was in a training and someone told me there will never be a time when what you say matters more than during a crisis. People are going to forget, certain things, but when the temperature gets turned up, they're really going to be interested in what you're talking about. So making sure that you are communicating in a way that mitigates those concerns. Number three, really looking at our long-term strategy. How do we make sure that what we're doing is sustainable going forward? Sometimes crises are a little blip on the radar. You kind of go back to where you were, and other times it's more of an earthquake where you can't necessarily keep walking down the same path that you were. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can't reach your end destination, but rather that you're not going to be on the same path. And so how do we keep that end in mind, even when we're in a blip or in a radar, or we're trying to cross a chasm, that's been made by the earthquake that we're facing? The last one I'll touch on here is really whose guidance can you follow and can you trust during this organization? I've often heard leaders say, heavy is the head that wears the crown. And so sometimes you feel like you are isolated, that you're making decisions that you can't really reverberate against another source. I would tell you during a crisis, you're going to have to figure out a way to find people that you can count on and trust. Ideally, you already have a team that you've helped build, that you've brought in, that you've helped foster, that you've helped meld to be those support people for you. But if you haven't yet, or you're not at that level of comfort, it's going to be critical that you find it pretty quickly, because you can't do this alone. I know Alan has had many opportunities where, the instinct may be to just control it and do it yourself. But he and I have talked about the fact that you really need to be able to have a team that you trust, that you can count on. You simply can't do it alone in situations like these. So let me segue now into talking about the 8 effective ways to lead in crisis. And Alan and I, as we were preparing these materials, were extremely diligent in trying to come up with ways that were not only effective, but that were practical. And so our hope in the discussion today is that you come away with actionable items, things that you can implement as soon as you have a need, and hopefully it'll be a long time before you have a need, but in reality, these may be things that you implement this afternoon. And so we're going to talk about these 8 effective ways. The first is really establishing this singular vision. And I always think it's helpful to give illustrative examples here. So for each of these, and starting with the first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we see as a way that you can accomplish this. So for example, when we talk about establishing a singular vision, I think one of the most known ways that you can talk about that is really looking at some of the ways that this has been done in the past. So I would give you, and the visual on the slide makes it clear, an example that starts in January of 1961, when President John F. Kennedy takes office. So he takes office during a period of civil unrest. there's a lot going on in America at that time. One of the things that's happening is that Americans perceive that they are losing the space race. So Sputnik 1 was launched by the Soviet Union 4 years earlier. By April of 1961, we've got the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin that has gone up and became the first man to go to space. And yet we've got a president who stands before Congress in May of 1961 and sets forth this vision that we are going to land a man on the moon and return him safely back home. Now, at that time, a Gallup poll was taken, and 58% of Americans thought that that was garbage, that that was the wrong thing to be focusing on. We've got so many other things, both domestically and abroad, that are trying for our attention, and yet we're talking about sending a man to the moon. And so what happens is that President Kennedy goes to Rice Stadium, September of 1962. He's looking for a way to communicate to the American public the importance of it. And so in addition to casting a vision of sending a man to the moon and returning him safely home, President Kennedy uses that warm, Texas day in front of the 40,000 people that are assembled in Rice Stadium and talks again about how it is America's destiny to go to the moon. He reinforces the singular vision that he started the previous spring to talk about this is our goal. And as a nation, it's going to take all of us to get there. And that really became the critical rallying cry for Americans at that point. Now, we all know that that deliberately narrow focus that he created, that he rallied Americans around, was something that he never got to see, right? November of 1963 changed his America, it changes the world as we know it, and President Kennedy never gets to see the fulfillment of his dream. But in reality, in July of 1969, when Apollo 11 mission launches and is a success, we all know that we as Americans rejoice jointly in the fact that this singular vision is achieved. So let Alan talk a little bit about how do we transcend that to healthcare when we're facing our own crisis? How do we establish a singular vision that we all need to follow through on?
So thanks, Amy. We are pretty clear that in things like Hurricane Harvey, when we had a little bit more time to plan, 3 or 4 days, we went back and reviewed the mission and vision and all those things. But we set the crisis vision for the organization. During Hurricane Harvey, it was fairly straightforward. It was everybody goes home. That was our goal. We didn't appreciate at the time that 800 of us would not have homes to go to when we got done, but we wanted everybody to go home. And so every decision we made was around that very notion. With COVID-19, the decision, the singular vision at the very front of this was that none of our caregivers died. Of the 8,000 plus people we have in our organization and the 5,000 physicians that we have associated with us one way or another, no one dies. So that's been our driving motivation throughout COVID-19. And I would like to see we were successful, but that would be disingenuous. We had a caregiver die early on from COVID-19, community acquired and could not survive. We did not change our vision. It became no other caregiver dies. And so we've maintained that to the point where we've got about 0.4% of our staff who've been impacted by COVID-19 when other organizations have had 20%. So it can be as simple as something in a reputational crisis because you've had a malpractice case play out on the front page of the paper. And your decision then is not to lose any referrals, not to lose your referral base, not to lose something. But when you're doing these things, you create that one singular vision. Nobody dies. Everybody goes home. In the case of a balcony collapse at Virginia Tech, it was make sure every parent gets notified, something fairly simple. And then all of your decisions are guided around that. And it allows you to be consistent with your mission and your vision and your values. But it also helps focus all of your decision making so that you're quick and you're clean and you're neat and you're able to move on in a rapid fashion, understanding that as long as you held true to that vision, you were in great shape.
Thanks, Alan. Let's talk about a second one. So our second effective way is to decide once and act once. And for all of our basketball fans, I'm going to start out with a quick video clip and then we'll talk about it. So if you're a Bulls fan, get ready. If you're a Cleveland Cavs fan, I'm sorry.
Myers has Jordan. Jordan with 2 seconds to go, puts it up and scores at the buzzer. Michael Jordan has won it for Chicago. Michael Jordan hit the basket at the buzzer. And the Chicago Bulls will move on to play the New York Knicks in the best of 7.
So it's game 5 of the NBA playoffs. It's May, it's 1989. Michael Jordan is an icon already at that time. The Bulls are playing the Cavaliers, and it's a back and forth game. You know, in the last couple minutes of the game, there's lead changes galore. And so what happens is there's an inbounded pass with seconds left on the clock. Michael Jordan gets the ball, and he has to decide, am I going to take the shot or am I going to pass the shot? Because there's really no time to think twice about it. So Jordan obviously decides to take the shot. It's great, again, for the Bulls. They win the game. You know, they go on in the playoffs. But this really gives us an example of the importance of deciding once and acting once. Jordan didn't have time to think twice. Really, there were seconds left. And sometimes it may be that you have seconds to decide. Sometimes those seconds feel really quick. And really, they're a matter of days, but it goes by very, very quickly. And so it's important to decide once and act once. So Alan, tell us a little bit more about that.
So in crisis, you oftentimes don't have all the information you need. You are making some judgments based off of your past experience, based off of what limited data you have. But you still nonetheless have to make a decision and go forward and be decisive. What you don't want to do in crisis is waver, and you don't want to waffle. You don't want to decide that it's blue and then it's green and then it's blue and then it's green and somebody else says, hey, purple would be nice. We don't want to go there. We want to decide blue is the answer. We're going blue and blue's it. So during Hurricane Harvey, we had to make a decision. When do you call the ride out? So when do you bring in 600 people to sit in a hospital and tell them they're not leaving? Oh, and by the way, you're going to be surrounded, as you well know, by 6 feet of water potentially for days on end. And you don't know if the hurricane's going to hit at a certain time or where. And so we made a decision early on that we would come in a full 12 hours ahead of the rest of the city's planned arrival to the hospital. It turns out that when Hurricane Harvey hit, that decision was the best one we made. For a full day, it seemed like we were there too early, and other hospitals had delayed now because the weather had slowed down and not moved in. However, when it hit, the flooding was much worse than anybody could have expected. We had 2 full shifts of staff to run 12-hour shifts for an entire 6-day time period, well-stocked, well-staffed, the whole 9 yards. When other hospitals were staffed crisis, they didn't have enough physicians, not enough nurses, not enough therapists. They ran out of materials and goods. Making a decision once early on, sticking with it, going through it, allowed us to be better prepared and allowed us to have a much better outcome. Data changes. Be comfortable with the unknown. Be comfortable altering your game. But once you've made a decision, stick with it, go with it, and then follow that through. Give your staff the opportunity to make decisions, and then trust them to do the right thing and get out of their way. So decide once, act once, and move on. You will find in group practices, medical group practices in particular, depending on the type of crisis, you've got to have somebody making decisions for the next couple of weeks and then the next time period of months and perhaps years. We see that when we've lost critical members of some of our medical practices due to health issues. What are we going to do in the next 2 weeks to get through this? What are we going to do in the next 3 months? How are we going to manage this over the next year? And so that's difficult, but you give it to different people, so the same people are not always making a decision. That way you come to your conclusions really well. And so we found that to be extraordinarily effective here.
Thanks, Alan. So let's talk about our third tip, which is to provide daily communication. So this graphic is probably recognizable to many of you. What you may not know is that Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985. He goes on to dig deep into his pockets and come up with $5 million to buy Pixar, which at that point was a relatively unknown entity owned by Lucasfilms. And yes, George Lucas of that Lucasfilms. So Steve Jobs buys Pixar and he desperately wants to turn it around. Part of it, people say, is because of his ego, which is bruised from having been ousted from Apple, but also because he's an entrepreneur. He's a successful businessman. And so what he decides is that critical to the importance of Pixar's success is daily communication, making sure that all of the different factions of the graphic designers, of the illustrators, of all those people, the animators are getting together and talking. So what he decides to do is build an atrium that really housed all of the core functions of the business. It had the cafeteria, it had the mailroom, it had the gift shop. It had even, at one point, the only bathrooms on campus that Steve Jobs was going to allow. That was ultimately nixed by architects. But the point was that by having this central area where people were forced to be together, to be communicative, it would force the discussions sort of, naturally as people walk by each other, but also because they were literally seeing each other for so many of their daily needs, that discussion would take place. And it was a gamble, right? People didn't really see that atrium concept much. They saw it more by functional design with buildings for each of the respective areas. But Steve's gamble turned out to be all right. He released Toy Story as his first full-length motion picture in 2006 after a series of successful movies. He ended up selling Pixar to Disney for $7.4 billion. And again, that $5 million investment that he scraped together looked pretty good at that point. But he would tell you, and he's told in interviews while he was alive, that his success at Pixar was building a culture that thrived on really integrated communication. And so we say in everyday business, but certainly in times of crises, that it is critical that you're providing daily communication. So Alan?
Well, let's go through three here really quickly that have happened. Proactive communication is obviously critical, and the staff need to know what you're doing. They need to know what the plan is. They want to get behind you. You have to be transparent, understand the why. We start every conversation here with the why. We're always honest. If things look bad, we're going to tell you it looks bad. If the financial situation is tough, we're going to tell you financially it's tough. If we had a sentinel event that had a bad patient outcome, we're going to talk about it in a way that is protecting patient privacy, but it tells everybody what we did and what we're doing about it. And so let's give you a couple of examples really quickly. Hurricane Harvey hits, and you can imagine 600 people and several hundred patients. And the question, and there are thousands of people at home who want to know what's going on at the hospital. So we put out communication at Hurricane Harvey 20 hours a day. We put it out roughly at least once every hour to an hour and a half. Sometimes it would come in 15-minute bursts, depending on what the notion was. Rumor control, rising floodwaters, need to move cars. We're about to land a helicopter. We don't have a helicopter pad. Please come do this. So that communication went out frequently, went out on all sorts of different venues. But go forward now to my hospital. When I arrived, 9 days after I arrived, the CEO departed. And then about another 14 days after that, we have a Joint Commission survey, and the Joint Commission survey comes and says, you've got 13 immediate threats to life. You have 23 days to correct it. So here's a crisis for a hospital. You have 23 days to correct things. Well, the very first thing we did was we told everybody what our issue was, and we put it in writing. We put it out there, and we ran the risk that it would show up in the newspaper. In fact, it did, and we worked through that issue as well. But we put it out there. We told everybody what we were doing. How do you get behind it? What do you need to do to be successful? At the end of the day, we come back 6 months later after going through a series of Joint Commission surveys, and the Joint Commission says, completely different hospital than the day we walked in, turned around, very attuned to all the Joint Commission survey expectations, and we do great. Then COVID hits. And so when COVID hits, what do we do now? Well, because we all were in the boat together, and you can recall this back in March, we didn't really know what was coming. We started planning here for COVID, quite frankly, in February. We were a little bit ahead of the game for some good reasons. But we decided we would communicate daily with COVID. And so we took the daily memo that we used during our crisis with the Joint Commission and our reputational damage that we were suffering, that daily memo that we put out to staff, and we turned that into a COVID daily memo. And then we did a COVID call 7 days a week for about 2.5 months, where we did a call 1 o'clock every day, 7 days a week, that was on WebEx, and we had more than 1,000 people dial in every day. And that went on for a couple of months. And then we backed it off to now 2 times a week, and we still do the call on Mondays and Thursdays, and we still get between 250 and 300 people twice a week who dial into the call to hear what's going on. So that daily communication is essential, and it gets that sense of being connected. Today, we ran some numbers recently, and we looked at our daily memos and what responses we get, and we run about 40 to 1 positive to negative commentary, about 40 to 1. And we've probably gotten at this point in time almost 1,000 responses to our daily memos that have been sent out over the past year. So it's a fairly phenomenal number of really engaged staff. And that's the other thing we've seen as a result of this, that our engagement has improved dramatically. So you really need to do this daily, and you need to find many, many different venues, and your message will change based off of what your crisis is. A financial crisis is different than a hurricane. It's very different than a reputational crisis. It's very different than the sudden departure of a key executive.
Very good, Alan. Thanks. Again, that communication cannot be underscored. Let's talk about the fact that during a crisis, you need to remain very visible. We'll let George W. Bush speak in a second, but to preface this, George W. Bush was an elementary school classroom in Sarasota, Florida on the day of the 9/11 attack. And from a classroom inside Emma E. Booker Elementary School, he was learning of the first reports of what had happened in our great nation. And so he spent much of the day flying around in Air Force One as we try to figure out as a nation what was going on. What happened after that, though, is George W. Bush became one of the most highly visible leaders in a time when our country probably needed a really visible leader. This bullhorn address that I'm going to show you in a moment is from Ground Zero. On September 14th, President Bush addresses the rescue workers in New York City, and his cry is really a rallying cry for visibility, for remaining out front, not looking like you are taking on the personal attack, that you're ready for what may come next, that you're there with your people, again, the Ground Zero workers. So let's spend a second here in hearing his message.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
So you hear the message there. The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. It's that concept of him not only being present with the Ground Zero workers right on the front lines, but also this concept of we are not going to be pushed down, that you will hear from us soon. So Alan, talk about visibility in medical practices and in organizations you've been part of.
So it's really critically important that you're out there visible every day. Sometimes in crisis, one of the first things you want to do is go into your office and plan, and you want to go into your office and make phone calls and get everything together. And that's, quite frankly, not what you need to be doing. You need to have your plan and how you're going to manage, how you're going to communicate, but then you need to get out there in front of everybody, and you need to get out there quickly. If it's a crisis of something that you've lost your key physician, in my case, I lost one of my key interventional physicians to health issues, and quickly. Well, the staff was scared, the IR group was scared. They were, what are we going to do now? This person was a big producer for us. They did generate a lot of revenue for us. What's that going to mean to us? So the very first thing we did, when we met with everybody, we had that dialogue, we had the discussion. Here's the plan. Here's what we're doing next. What do you think? How would you do this? What can we do to move things around? So you're out there very, very quickly, very in front of things. When the social issues, the social unrest that hit with George Floyd, what did we do? How did we get out front? We couldn't sit in our offices and pretend it wasn't important. We have a diverse workforce. What do? Well, you get out there, and so you hold town halls, and you invite hundreds of people in the appropriately social distance way over because of COVID, and you do WebExes, and you have that discussion. You get up front and you say, this is who we are. This is what we know about ourselves. This is what we see. This is what our plan is for the future. This is how we do it. And then you make rounds, and you construct your teams to make rounds, and you be empathetic, and you care. And you always start off with this notion of how are you and how are you feeling? I was told a long time ago when I was young in my career, and I would come in and I would work really hard, shut my door and do my thing and go out and do the next thing, that I needed to learn to be more Southern. What do you mean to be more Southern? Well, first, Alan, you have to have a relationship with everybody. And so you have to get in contact with, and who are you working with, and you got to know your people. And so in a crisis, it's even more important. So all the work you do on a daily basis, getting to know your staff, getting to know your providers, getting to know the people, your key contacts, the hospital systems, those relationships matter, so that in crisis, you've got that developed, and you can come out and you can be empathetic, and you can be that voice of authenticity as you deliver the message that needs to be delivered. But you can't do it from your office. Even in times of COVID, put on your N95 mask if that's what's required, but get out there and see your folks and talk to them and let them know that you're in there with them and that you're leading from the front, not directing from the rear. And that's the really critical message about that.
That's perfect, Alan. Let's talk about this concept of carefully selecting your team. I think Alan and I have talked about it in myriad ways throughout this discussion, but it is critically important. So if you've never heard of the curse of the Bambino, you may not know, but the Boston Red Sox sold Babe Ruth, traded him to the New York Yankees. And so this is the stuff of folklore. That was the reason that the Boston team had such a hard go of it. But to the Yankees' benefit, they really cleaned up in having Babe Ruth. So in 1931, the team had Babe Ruth, it had Cy Perkins, it had Dixie Walker, it had Lou Gehrig, all names that, were kind of household names if you know anything about sports. And that year, that team did a lot of great things. But one of the things that they're most known for is holding the modern day Major League record for team runs scored in a season. They, as a team, scored 1,067 runs collectively, and they did it as a team. Babe Ruth may have been an awesome player, but it wasn't Babe Ruth that carried the team. It was really this team mentality that worked. They together banded together, and they got things done. And making sure that you have the right people on the team is critically important. I don't know if they could have done it without Babe Ruth, but it certainly didn't hurt that he was now a New York Yankee to bring the team some of those successes. So, Alan, talk to us more about teams.
I will tell you, this is the most important thing that you can do. You can get the right team. And I will tell you quick and simply, no drama queens. When you're getting ready for a hurricane, we had to decide who are the 600 people who are going to be with us in this building taking care of hundreds of patients. And so we sat down, and literally the directors and the managers went through every single person. And we made decisions. I made decisions about which vice presidents were going to be there. The vice presidents made decisions about the directors, etc. No drama queens, people who could do well in crisis, who were able to make decisions at the closest to the problem as possible, and then people that you would trust and you could get out of their way. You also want people who give you feedback without fear. If you've got somebody in your staff who's afraid to give you feedback, they're not going to be what you need in a crisis, because in a crisis, you need to hear different viewpoints. You need to hear different perspectives, and you need that feedback that's really critical to help you stick with your core vision. What's the one thing you're trying to do? So selecting your team is really, really important. We just don't do people that take a lot of energy to manage. If I have to manage you constantly, you're not who I want in a crisis. And so if it's in a joint commission crisis, who do I want around, right? I mean, I want the people that are the 6 or 7 critical key players that can really make a difference. During COVID, when we selected the command center leader, that was a great choice in that we chose somebody who was calm, even-keeled, thought well, could make decisions, was well respected in the organization, and just never got his feathers ruffled. During Hurricane Harvey, I can't tell you how many nurses I had. They were former Marines and Army Rangers, people with different life experiences that you wanted around you because they could improvise and they could solve problems in a hurry, sometimes in creative ways we would have never thought about. We did that same thing during COVID-19 here in Lansing, and we've had a remarkable response in our community, and we've had a remarkable success rate here with how we've managed things both outpatient, inpatient, clinically, and financially. And so it's done well. So I think those are really the critical things you got to do. When you choose your team, what are the critical skills and characteristics? Above all, they've got to learn to be great team members. If you've got people who want to be one-offs and they like the glory and they just want to make it all about them, now's not the time. I don't care how smart they are. They don't need to be here. You need a team that can be a team. You choose the best 5, not the 5 best. That's really important.
That's awesome, Alan. I agreed. I can't But communication and building the right team are the most critical components of this in my mind. So if you take away nothing else from this presentation, make sure that you emphasize team and communication. We're coming to the last of our few, but number 6 is really about becoming involved in your community, especially when it's a large-scale crisis. We've all alluded to Hurricane Harvey. So Hurricane Harvey was a Category 4 hurricane that pummeled Texas and Louisiana in April of 2017. It rained 40 to 60 inches of water to the Houston metropolitan and outlying areas. It inflicted $125 billion in damage, and it left 350,000 Texans without electricity. It was a massive, crisis in that area. As Alan said, he was an executive vice president at the time working in the community. He knows it well. But there are certainly others in the community that face this. So let's hear a couple words from other Texans who reflect upon their experiences during Hurricane Harvey.
I am always aware there are people who, in fact, are still not in their homes and are still suffering enormously. Harvey put 48 inches of water into our garage. There were 3 houses on my street which were viable, the rest were destroyed. So I'm in touch with the enormous destruction of Harvey all the time, both at home and at work. We've had a couple of Schwartz rounds where people who were in Harvey have told incredibly sad stories about their families. So this day here, volunteering, is, for me, just part of the whole picture. It's something we have to do. We have to donate money. We have to keep donating our time and our energy and our sympathy to help these people impacted by it.
So Alan, talk to us more about becoming involved.
I spent 5 days surrounded by 6 feet of water. More than a year later, more than 2 years later now, it causes an emotional sort of response to see Jeff Katz, great doc from Memorial Hermann. It is remarkably important to get in touch with your community and do it first and do it fast and be there for what they need. During Hurricane Harvey, we were the place everybody came to because we were the hospital, but once the hospital was open again for total business, we never shut down. But once the roads were open, we reached out to the churches and to the schools, and we reached out to the community groups that we needed to help because they were suffering so much. And so you had to reach out in any way you can. And what a healthcare practice does and what a hospital does is, you lead the community. The greatest intellectual firepower, some of the best decision makers and some of the best problem solvers in any community are those in the medical world, right? It's the medical group practices, and it's the hospitals, and it's the clinics that really can step up. And so you need to understand what your role can be and be creative in how you think about it. So for us, simply things that we did, we reached out and started to deal with some food insecurity issues. We dealt with the school systems. We didn't forget about our community over the course of the next year. And so at Christmas, we arranged, our hospital sponsored an elementary school. Every child in the elementary school got a winter coat because it does get a little cold in Houston. Every child got a winter coat. Every child got a toy. Every child was taken care of because the families lost everything. And Christmas was going to be terrible in Houston, but for a lot of people who figured out that the children were the real victims of this, more so than many of the rest of us, and they deserved to have a part. So become involved in your community. With COVID-19, it's being out there first, and it's being out there printing information, giving information, putting out publications. This is what it's about. You can rely on government agencies if you choose, but in your community, you're the experts and people expect you to be there. So how do you leverage that expertise? We reached out immediately to Michigan State University. We reached out to all of our providers. And as a group, we then reached out to our community. And again, we've done things around food insecurity and blood donations. And, when we were going through a series of social unrest things, we reached out to the NAACP because we wanted to make sure that people understood what our role is in the community, and that's caring for the community. So how do you do that? It may not mean, putting you in the hospital and performing a procedure. It may mean caring for the community is to provide inspiration and sometimes information and sometimes it means that you help them solve difficult problems. And so it's really important. The benefits of this are long lasting. And when I say they're long lasting, I'm talking years and years. People will remember what you did for years. It's not it's important about how you make people feel in the community. And if they feel like they can trust you, they will do that. So you get out early, and that's how you manage these things.
That's great, Alan. Agreed. So one of the other fast ways we can talk about effective methods of leadership is really making sure that you protect your staff. So Mark Conklin was the general manager of the JW Marriott in Hong Kong in the middle of the SARS outbreak in 2003. He was interviewed recently to talk about the impacts of COVID on the hospitality industry, drawing on his experience with SARS. And what he told was a story of executives who decided to forego 4 months of paid compensation so that there would be payroll expenses to put towards frontline staff who obviously were greatly impacted by the lack of people coming to visit Hong Kong at that time. And so his conversation was about making sure that you do things that matter to the staff. Not only did executives there give up their own compensation, but they got creative in looking for ways that they could find projects that were still valuable to the hospital, but that would provide remuneration to employees. So they looked at CapEx projects that they had been putting off. They used front desk workers to rip up old carpet and replace it. Any opportunity to provide some security financially for those staff members. And I think we have to remember that in healthcare entities, there are so many staff usually in our practices, in our hospitals. And so how do we protect them as people and as employees? So Alan?
So clearly communicating and planning for your staff's protection in COVID-19, it's been all about PPE. During Hurricane Harvey, it was all about their safety in the building. During the balcony collapse, it was making sure that your staff had a break. And so you take any one of these things. But the thing you need to remember, and there's a simplest way to think of this slide, is that your heroes are also your victims. And so you have to be thinking about your staff in that context. You have to think about them heroically, and you have to think about the impact that the disaster is having on them, and then work through issues to protect them going forward. Because if you lose them and they're not available, the entire world hurts.
Absolutely. And our last one today is to make sure that you serve as a steward for finances. So this picture is of Ursula Burns. Ursula Burns was the prior CEO of Xerox. She succeeded Anne Mulcahy, who really came in the middle of a $17 billion in debt Xerox company. And so Anne really started to turn things around, but it was then incumbent on Ursula, who was not only the first African-American female CEO of a Fortune 500 company, she was also the first female to ever succeed a female CEO of a Fortune 5 company. She had lots of eyes on her. And what she's been reported as saying is, my success was really keeping an eye on the dollar. How do we make sure that we keep our finances first and foremost to make sure that we have a company that continues to operate into the future? So Alan?
Oh my gosh, no margin, no mission. So you have to pay attention, right? There's no way to get around it. We don't pretend that that profit margin drives our decision making. It doesn't. We believe that quality and safety and engagement are more important, and that finances are a lagging indicator. That doesn't mean you ignore things, especially in crisis when there may be some measure of government relief coming via FEMA or another agency. You've got to keep track of it. You have to understand the economic impact. What we're very cognizant of is we want to spend our money well, and we want to lay out some scenarios. So obviously the longer term of the disaster, COVID-19, we've had better planning. It's been more simpler to do that. It's been easier. During Hurricane Harvey, we did it on the fly. We just kept track of everything. But again, we operated based off of the premise of Hurricane Harvey that everybody goes home. And so here at Sparrow, the cost of PPE has been devastating to all of us, but yet guided by the decision that none of our caregivers would die, helped us understand some of these priorities, and then we've tracked them appropriately. And what we've learned, of course, is that you always put money away because you are going to have a rainy day. Literally in Hurricane Harvey, figuratively in COVID-19, you will have a rainy day. and you have to plan for it ahead of time.
Absolutely. So we want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time sharing some information about the stabilize, mobilize, and capture model. One of the things that we often talk about in terms of leadership is it better to be a thermometer or to be a thermostat? And that, quite frankly, means, do you want to be a thermometer that takes the temperature of the organization? Or do you want to be the thermostat that sets the temperature? And for most leaders, the answer is you need to be the thermostat. So you need to make sure that you are helping set the tone for the organization. As we talk about in the stabilize, mobilize, and capitalize model, it's really important that you understand what you need to do both in the wave of crisis and then what you're going to do that's going to impact afterwards. So in the stabilize model, it's making sure that you prepare the organization to understand that what you're going through isn't necessarily what you're going to be going through later. So this is a new concept, but we have to work at it together. Obviously, afterwards, you take some of those key lessons learned and you make sure that you implement them as preparation for your next crisis. Mobilize are the things that we talked about here, making sure you have a great team in place, making sure that you come forward with over voluminous communications. Obviously, the impact of that is just making sure that you've got the right people working on the right things. And then finally, capitalizing. Some people kind of bristle at this concept because crisis is often not seen as being a time to capitalize, right? That doesn't feel very altruistic. It feels very self-serving. But in reality, the way that you capitalize on a crisis is to make sure that you learn from it. You don't necessarily have to make these massive changes, but you do need to reflect upon what happened and how you use that to impact the organization for the better. Not just then, but going forward as well. Alan, what else do you have to add about the SMC model?
I think you captured it, Amy. The one thing I would say is never waste a crisis. There is always a silver lining in a crisis. You need to figure out what it is and then take advantage.
Very good. So let's wrap up. Alan, why don't you really quickly walk us through a crisis communication plan? What are those central components? What do we need to think about?
So it's really clear. Set your team, choose your critical message that you want to get out, establish your talking points and do those for your constituent groups. Boards are different than frontline caregivers, different than the community. Figure that out and then start monitoring for feedback and then modify your message going forward as you need to.
Absolutely. Any major differentiators you would add, Alan, depending upon the type of crisis? What do we need to know about the financial versus an operational crisis?
Well, they're totally different. The financial crisis requires a different set of planning and a different set of key skills when you communicate. The financial, again, go back to the why, go back to what your current status is. Operational crisis, a little bit easier, quite frankly, than financial crisis because you can plug and play there a little bit more simply. So I think the difference for me is financial crisis requires more explanation. Operational crisis requires more immediate action.
Absolutely. We are at our time now, so it's time for us to wrap up. But let me say again how grateful Alan and I both are to have spent this time with you today. We look forward to chatting with you in follow-up about questions that you may have, and certainly wish you well during this crazy time of COVID and hereafter. Thanks for all you do for your organizations, for your teams, and make sure that you stay well. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending this wonderful session, and just want to thank Amy and Alan for this all their great information. Remember to visit the Solution Center to find partners that will talk about today's topics and other issues, and enjoy your conference throughout the day. Thank you.